Today we're going to be taking a look at the biggest draft bust classes from the 1990s. Today we'll be looking at the classes of 1991, 1992, and 2009. This is mostly because there are not very many players left from the '09 class. So let's get started. Starting off this 1991 draft class, let's look at the quarterbacks. We have one very large name to talk about, being Brett Favre. He was drafted out of Southern Mississippi. And obviously, he had a very long and historic career and played, I don't even know, 20 seasons basically. He accumulated 71,000 passing yards, almost 72, 508 touchdowns, and 336 interceptions. But the funny thing is, you look down that board, and the next people selected, as far as quarterbacks and their statistics, are all under 7,500 yards basically passing. It was a very, very weak draft class. There was the likes of Browning Nagel, Craig Erickson was in that draft class, as well as Todd Marinovich, considered the project out of USC that was drafted by the Raiders. But all in all, very, very weak draft class as far as quarterbacks. That's only really propped up by the legendary Brett Favre. Moving on to the running backs of this draft class, it's really only led by one person, being Ricky Watters. He had 10,600 yards, 78 rushing touchdowns. But after that, it's really a drop off. I mean, there's Gary Brown, Leonard Russell, both had about 4,000 yards, along with Harvey Williams. Seventh place on this rushing list, Brett Favre. He didn't even have 2,000 yards rushing, so you know that's not a great sign, as well as, well, he's no longer offensive coordinator in the NFL, Eric Bieniemy, who had less yards rushing than Brett Favre. Moving on to the 91 draft class, the wide receivers. The really only saving grace of this draft class as far as offensive players go, in my opinion, would be the wide receivers. You had Keenan McCardell at 11,000 yards, Herman Moore with 9,100, Jeff Graham at 8,100, Ed McCaffrey, the father of Christian McCaffrey, at 7,400, Sean Jefferson at 7,000, underrated wide receiver Jake Reed at 7,000 yards, Ben Coates in there, Rocket Ishmael, Mike Pritchard, and my favorite, well, one of my favorite players of all time, at least when I was younger, Yancey Thigpen. You know, this is a very decent, if not good, draft class, especially when you think about some of the names in here, but nothing that's Hall of Fame, where they maybe Keenan McCardell, you could make an argument for. Unfortunately, moving the defensive side, I don't have tackles, as it wasn't really recorded stat according to Pro Football Reference at this time, but I can look through some of the names later on, and we can see, I think Russell Maryland was in there somewhere. I believe that was in this draft class. But moving on to the defensive back side, the only really name of point on here is Aeneas Williams. He was a Hall of Famer. I believe he was on the Greatest Show on Turf team in the 1999 season, but he led the way with 55 interceptions. Todd Light, Merton Hanks, and Darrell Lewis, as well as Eric Turner, all had 30-plus interceptions. Not a great defensive back class, but keep in mind this was before the passing craze. That being said, you have to remember there's a lot more interceptions at this time, so I think it weighs itself out pretty evenly. But let's move on now to our defense of linemen / linebackers. Leading the way here, Michael Sinclair. He had 73.5 sacks. Phil Hansen behind him, as well as Alfred Williams. Brian Cox, notable name on there. He was good for a few years. And then, like I said, the aforementioned Russell Maryland as well. Not a great draft class as far as top tier talent, as far as sacks go, but you get guys like Russell Maryland who were huge impact guys for a few years. Next, we're going to move on to some honorable mention players to be named of this group. John Case, he was a kicker for the Lions for a long time. Originally drafted by Seattle, I did not know that. And Chris Gardocki, he was a punter. I think he's with the Bears for 7 years, something like that, if I remember correctly from my youth. As well as Keith Tractor Trailer. He played for a hot minute. And there was one named Kevin Donnelly. I don't really know who he is, but he was drafted by the Oilers in the third round, 79th overall, and he played almost 200 games. So like I said, not a huge group of guys that, you know, stood out stat-wise. I was not alive in 91, so I could be wrong. So those of you who were alive, please feel free to let me know. But next, we're going to move on to the draft class of 1992. We're going to start off once again with the quarterbacks. Obviously, this was a very big year for busts for quarterbacks, including David Klinger, as well as Matt Blunden. I have no idea who he is, but he was drafted in the second round, which I know is not really a draft bust, but 40th overall by Kansas City. He put up 15 yards passing in his career, and he played for about 7 seasons, 6 seasons. So not necessarily the biggest as far as production. But back to the actual production, led the way in this draft class, Brad Johnson, Super Bowl champion Brad Johnson with the Tampa Bay Bucks. He had 2,900 or 29,000, my bad, passing yards, 166 touchdowns, and 122 interceptions, followed by Jeff Blake, 21,000 yards. Dave Brown was behind that, who was actually a supplemental pick by the Giants, who I believe he took over after Matt Sims, or Phil Sims left, not Matt Sims, that's his son. And then Tommy Maddox, the only other first rounder that really performed and did anything, he was that of UFL, not UFL, now UFL, XFL fame back in 2001, I believe. Not a great draft class, could be better. Ty Detmer, name of note on here. I think he was the all-time passing leader in college history when he left. Not a great draft class by any means for the quarterbacks. Out of the running backs, leading the way with just under 4,000 yards rushing, Edgar Bennett. I'm a Packers fan, love Edgar Bennett growing up. I didn't realize how really unproductive this draft class was until I looked at it. I mean, second place is Jeff Blake with 2,000 yards rushing. Probably the worst running back class of all time, if I will say so myself. There are some notable names down below, like Sam Gash, who's not really even a running back. He was a fullback for quite a few years. I think he was even on the Ravens Super Bowl winning team. But yeah, this is just a really pitiful draft class for running backs. I mean, Bennett's the only person who cracked 20 rushing touchdowns as well as 1,000 attempts. I mean, even 500 attempts from the looks of it. Just a very, very weak running back draft class. On to the wide receivers. Leading the way for them is Jimmy Smith, potential Hall of Famer. I don't think he'll ever get there, but he could be just like his counterpart in McCardle from the year before when they played together in Jacksonville. But he had 12,000 receiving yards and 67 touchdowns. Just behind him was Carl Pickens with 7,063 touchdowns. And then it kind of drops off. The likes of Torrance Small, Courtney Hawkins, Robert Brooks, Ampley, Mark Chmura, and Edgar Bennett. It's funny because Desmond Howard was the 4th overall pick in this class, just a total bust. But a lot of guys who played roles with the Packers on that Super Bowl championship run in '96. And even 97 when they lost to the Broncos. So I really feel like this is a draft that succeeded in key players, like role players, but not necessarily in stars when it comes to the receiving core. Once again, we're going to move on to the defensive back since there's no solo tackles category at all this late back. Leading the way for that is Terrell Buckley of the Green Bay Packers with 50. That's who he was drafted by. Troy Vincent, Ashley Ambrose, all over 40 interceptions. And you have the likes of Darren Perry, Darrell Williams, and Kurt Schultz. They all had over 30. Nice thing about this, Darrell Williams, he had 31 interceptions and 9.5 sacks throughout his career. He was a defensive back. I don't know if he was a corner or a safety. I'm assuming he was a safety, looking at the fact that he had sacks, but I could be wrong. Not a great core for defensive backs. Oh, yeah, Darren Woodson. I'm sorry. Yeah, it's not necessarily the stats, but Darren Woodson, Hall of Famer, great player. I didn't realize he did not actually have crazy numbers. I thought he was better than that as far as interceptions. I kind of always viewed him more as a playmaker, but not necessarily a great class as far as depth in this sense. Moving on to the sack artists, we have Robert Porcher leading the way. He was with the Lions for quite a few years. Gave Brett Favre and my Packers some struggles. He had 95.5 sacks. I'm not really sure why he's never been put in consideration for the Hall of Fame. I feel like that's a really good number to have to potentially make it, especially back in those days. Behind that, we have Marco Coleman, Keith Hamilton, and Tracy Scroggins. You know, they all had 60-plus sacks. Chuck Smith at 58.5. And then other names on here would be Santana Dotson, Brad Culpepper, if you remember him with the Tampa Bay Buccaneers for a hot minute, and the Minnesota Vikings. Other than that, Levon Kirkland with the Pittsburgh Steelers, but not really a lot of other names that I'm seeing that really had crazy careers or names of note. Moving on to other notable names. I said John Case played for Detroit. He might have for a couple seasons at the end of his career, but I meant John Hanson as a guy. He's a name of note on this draft class. Taken the second round, pick 56 overall. extremely early for kicker in those times. Bob Whitfield as well in this draft class. He had one Pro Bowl. I don't really know a lot about him, but he was taken 8th overall. As you kind of scroll down, like I said before, Sam Gash is a notable name. John Fina, he had a really good career in Buffalo, and I think might have also played in Seattle towards the end of his career. But that's going to wrap up for 1992. At the end of this, I will go over all the stats and stuff in comparison, but we're going to move on to the year 2009. On to 2009, where the quarterback situation was less than ideal if you take out Matthew Stafford, who is still slinging it to this day with the Rams. After that, he had 56,000 yards passing so far and 357 touchdowns. But after that, we have Mark Sanchez, who has 15,000 yards and 86 touchdowns and 89 interceptions. Josh Freeman. All these guys were first-round picks, 1st, 5th, and 17th in this draft. He definitely had some bright moments in Tampa Bay, but really struggled after, I think, year 3 there. He had 13,000, almost 14,000 yards, and he had 81 touchdowns. After that, you have Curtis Painter, Keith Null, Stephen McGee. Like, there's just really nothing of note there as far as quarterbacks. Just a really poor quarterback class behind Stafford. There were some moments, but nothing spectacular. On to the running backs. At number 1, we have Shady McCoy, LeSean McCoy. He had 11,000 yards rushing. I didn't realize he had that many yards. I know he had a very productive career. But yeah, he had 11,000 yards rushing, 73 touchdowns, as well as almost 4,000 yards receiving. Behind that, we had Sean Green, who had a couple of good seasons with the Jets, with Sanchez, and he had 4,000 yards rushing. I think if he didn't have knee problems and was probably a little healthier, he might have done a little bit more. After that, Rashad Jennings, who really had the best season of his career. I think it was in 2014 or 2015, if I remember correctly, with the Giants. Noshan Moreno, who was taken the first round. I didn't realize he had such a poor career, if you will, especially because I thought he did really well for a long time, but he only played like 5 or 6 years, and he only had 3,600 yards. Donald Brown's in here. Beanie Wells, who retired in 2012. He was on his way to having a decent career, in my opinion. 2,400 yards there. Bernard Scott. Percy Harvin's obviously in this list as well as far as running backs. But once again, not a great class after you get past LeSean McCoy. Now, the receivers in this class aren't necessarily the greatest of all time. I mean, you have Edelman and whatnot, but I don't feel like there's any true superstars in this class. You had Mike Wallace, who had some good years, Pittsburgh, Miami, and the Vikings. Michael Crabtree, who's probably the most consistent receiver for his whole career between San Francisco, Oakland. I think he might have played with Baltimore one season. I don't remember offhand. Jared Cook, Jeremy Maclin, Edelman, like I said, Kenny Britt, that is, Hakeem Nicks. Percy Harvin's down there, Brandon Pettigrew, Darius Hayward Bay, who was taken in the first round, 7th overall, and he even broke 3,000 yards. No, he just came short of 3,000 yards receiving. But at the top, 8,000 from Wallace, 7,500 from Crabtree, 7,300 from Cook. Maclin just shy of 7,000, as well as Edelman, and then Britt and Nicks both at about 5,000. Not necessarily, like I said, the greatest draft class for receivers. I think it was okay. I think you had a lot of guys who were solid. I mean, in that mix, you also had Austin Collie, who had, I think, like 2 or 3 good years with Peyton Manning before all of his injuries obviously took his career away from him. Since solo tackles are recorded in 2009, take a look at some of these individuals. Malcolm Jenkins led the way with 804. James Laurinaitis had 664. Jason McCourty, 600. Glover Quinn, 580, and Patrick Chung at 521. Other notable names in this group: Brian Cushing, DeAndre Levy, Clay Matthews, and Ray Malalagu. All in all, I'd say that tackles in this class aren't necessarily anything crazy. I mean, Malcolm Jenkins, I think he played corner for a few years before switching to safety, and I'm sure that's probably where he racked up most of his tackles in his career. Let's move on next to interceptions here. At the top of the list, Jarius Byrd, Glover Quinn, Vontae Davis, famed for retiring at halftime, Malcolm Jenkins, Jason McCourty, and William Moore. Other names as mentioned, like I said, Captain Mutterland down there. There's not really any crazy good defensive backs or corners besides Malcolm Jenkins. I think there's a lot of solid guys who had good careers and maybe had a couple really good seasons, but nothing that makes you be like, wow, this was a studded, defensive back class. Let's move on next to our sack artists. Leading the way, Clay Matthews Jr., 91.5. I don't think he's a Hall of Famer, but there's a lot of argument to be made. I mean, he had 91.5 sacks, obviously. I think he needed 2 more years to really put himself there. Brian Arakpo, really good career at 66. Connor Barwin at 56.5. He earned himself a really nice deal, I think, in 2016 with the Jaguars, if I remember correctly. Paul Kruger, Michael Johnson, Robert Ayers, Henry Melton. There's just, some guys that weren't really all that great, but they were around. BJ Raji's in here as well. Lower down, for guys who have name power and recognition. Let's see, anybody else here? Not offhand. So yeah, not a great class as far as overall sack artists. There's a couple guys at the top who are solid. I think guys like Robert Ayers and stuff like that were more name recognition as far as that, but not necessarily stat driven. Moving on to conclusion, we're going to wrap this up as quick as I can, leading the way with all pro ballot votes. 1991 had 21, 92 had 8, and 2009 had 6. Stafford could get one more, but I doubt it. Pro Bowls, not as useful now. Back in the day it was, but once again, 91 led the way with 76, 92 had 59, and 2009 had 56. Starting seasons, 92 led the way with 571 starting seasons, 91 had 555, and 2009 had 514. Moving on to weighted average, leading the way is 1991 with 19.92, 18.57 for 1992, and 17.33 for 2009. Draft average is kind of what they brought to their teams they were drafted by. 1991 led the way with 13.01, and then 2009 with 12.76, and 1992 with 12.08. I don't know what those stats really mean, but I think it's the closest estimate I could say to WAR for baseball, maybe. So that goes. Games played. Obviously, the 1990 stats are a little bit different because they had so many more players that you could choose from for drafts. I think they had like 12 rounds back then, but 92 led the way, followed by 91 and 2009. We're going to skip over completions and attempts, but we'll go straight to yards. Yards, 1992 led the way with 98,888, followed by 1991, who had 91,189. And then now 2009, 88,154. Obviously, Stafford, if he has a really big year, could surpass that for them. Moving on to touchdowns. 91 led the way with 601, 92 had 540, and 2009 had 538. Once again, Stafford should propel them up at least one spot, maybe two if he plays a couple more years at a high level. Interceptions, 92 and 91 lead the way, followed by 2009. Moving on to rushing yards. This one's a pretty drastic split. 91 led the way with 43,592, followed by 2009 with 39,254, and last, the year 1992 with 19,184. Moving on to rushing touchdowns, 91 led the way with 274, 2009 with 263, and 141 for 1992. Receiving yards, 91 had the best class in that. They led the way with 124,302, followed by 09 with 97,350, and last but not least, 92 had 61,500 touchdowns, almost 700 touchdowns for 91, followed by 544 for 2009 and 388 for 92. I'm gonna skip over tackles because I don't have those stats all the way through. 92 led the way with 566, followed by 1991 having 528, and last but not least, 2009 with 413. Sacks, obviously, I think this stat is a little bit different since back in the day there were more players who played, or not played, but were drafted, so they have a chance to maybe have more overall numbers, but there was also some higher totals for some of these guys in these draft years. 92 had 1,186, followed by 91 with 956.5, and last but not least, 2009 was 727.5. I will put this in a Google Docs so that way you guys can see it and review it and kind of look over some things. But all in all, I think these are the three worst draft classes since 1990. So I would say basically in my lifetime, I was born in 92, so it is what it is. And obviously anything after 2009, 2010, there's still quite a few guys playing who could still, do some stuff to some sort. But let me know in the comments below what you think. I do actually have a video plan to break down all the years from 2000 through 2009 and kind of on a ranking scale. That will be a very brief video. I probably won't go too in depth like I did in this video. If there's any other draft years you'd like me to break down and look at, feel free to let me know in the comments down below. Thanks for watching, guys, and until next time, thank you.